Because I think, in your words, 100k is basically one of the worst salaries you can earn. The marginal tax rate is so high.
Exactly. So between that 100 and 125,000, because you're losing your personal allowance as well, you're basically being taxed the 20% you had free on top of your 40% tax. So that's why it ends up being this 60%.
Lack of hope and powerlessness that is evident in the working class and the middle class in this country. And that is dangerous, I would argue. Politically dangerous, socially and economically dangerous.
Is £100,000 the worst salary you can earn in Britain? It may sound like a decent wage, but when you factor in fiscal drag, the rising cost of living and the cliff edge for state-funded childcare, many people who are earning six figures don't feel wealthy at all. In fact, they feel angry. And this matters, not just because the top 10% of earners pay 60% of all income tax, or because of the number of better off people who are leaving the country. It matters because if Britain is a country where a comfortable middle-class life is beyond reach, then it is a country without hope. I'm Alys Denby, opinion and features editor of City AM, and in this episode of Free Thinking, I'm discussing the 100k tax trap with author and City AM columnist Eliza Filby and wealth advisor and financial influencer Philly Ponniah.
Eliza, Philly, thanks so much for being here, especially on a tube strike day. So congratulations on making it in. But we are here to talk about the equally sympathetic subject of high earners. Let's start with this question. Is 100k a high salary, Eliza?
Well, I wrote an article with this very headline and saying that 100k wasn't a high salary. And we can talk about why in respect to the childcare allowance and the tax burden that this kind of tax bracket, those on 100k are, make up 10% of earners, but pay 50% of all tax receipts, and are increasingly feeling 9 out of 10 people that earn over 100k do not consider themselves wealthy, which is an extraordinary statistic, given that I think psychologically the 100k is like a threshold that people aspire to reach, but actually those that have don't feel like it's given them the wealth they thought it would. And so this isn't about saying you're on the breadline if you earn 100k. This is more about saying there's a mismatch of expectations of what a 100k salary brings you in today's Britain.
And Philly, you regularly work with people who are earning decent salaries but not feeling it in their pockets. Can you tell us about some of the challenges that they're encountering?
Absolutely. So I would say it usually, the conversation usually starts around childcare. So if they've got one child at nursery or two, that's huge sums to pay for that. You lose your childcare funded hours once you go over the 100,000. Some people are planning to have them and then they don't realise that they miss out if maybe a bit of interest from cash in the bank has pushed them over. A lot of people don't understand this concept of net adjusted income, which is where your salary kind of adds on your bonus, and if you get taxable benefits at work, benefits in kind, so sort of all sorts of numbers add to your salary and can jeopardise receiving funded childcare hours. So we've got people kind of worrying about childcare costs.
And is there anything you can do if you're confronted with these huge childcare costs?
Well, it's just making sure that this net adjusted income figure stays below that 100,000. So it's really kind of taking note every month what you're getting, including anything like private medical insurance sometimes counts as a benefit in kind, so that adds to your salary. An example recently, someone as an individual, it added £2,000 to her annual salary if she was insured for through her work for medical. Adding her daughter made it over 5,000.
Wow.
And adding the husband made it 8,000 for the family of three. So for her, she didn't end up adding the daughter or the husband. They've gone and got their own private medical insurance. So her benefit in kind for that was £2,000. So that added to the income. So it's getting clear on what adds and then thinking about what can bring it down below 100,000 if you kind of are near that level, and putting money into your pension. So you can either do that from your net salary into like a self-invested personal pension, which is a SIP, and that figure comes off your pension, or through salary sacrifice through work. You're putting the money into your pensions, you'll bring your salary down that way.
Great tips.
I mean, if we want to know how politically sort of charged this issue is, just think back to when Jeremy Hunt sort of said, I think it was in the run-up to the last election, that his
Like he was running for Tory leader?
Oh, right, even worse. Yeah. Even more, damaging to his image. But he said in a radio interview, I think it was, that, a lot of his Surrey constituents were really suffering on 100k. And that sort of blew up, didn't it? And sort of and that's, I think, illustrative of how difficult it is to talk about this and how politically unwise it is to talk about this entirely.
And then also, I think if people arranged a mortgage a few years ago when it was 2% for their mortgage payments, they potentially borrowed a bit more. They didn't maybe think about affordability for when interest rates would rise. Because we had interest rates that were low for so long, I think people didn't think they would get up to 5%. No, so actually outgoings have gone up, £500, £1,000 more a month. And actually that is where potentially there might have been a bit of buffer to have some, discretionary spend. And actually I'm seeing quite a lot of people where there's not much left at the end of the month. And, some people are like 1 month away from kind of going into debt.
Let's talk about some of the huge distortions that this has on people's behaviour. Of people refusing pay rises because they don't want to go over that 100k. And also you have people changing their behaviour. I mean, you've had people who've put off having second children, put off fertility treatment and so on. Because I think, in your words, 100k is basically one of the worst salaries you can earn. The marginal tax rate is so high.
Exactly. So between that 100 and 125,000, because you're losing your personal allowance as well, you're basically being taxed the 20% you had free on top of your 40% tax. So that's why it ends up being this 60%, and then there's national insurance on top. So it's punitive at that level. And I'm seeing people where they wait to have a second child once the first has started school. So there'll then be kind of that 4-year gap. They might have maternity leave where they then have to, take the child out of nursery sometimes on their maternity leave. And I don't know, I've got 2 small children. Having them both at home would have been quite a lot during maternity leave. So, or just actually only having 1 child. I heard a question the other day from someone who was 32 saying, why bother having children? Because it's going to cost so much. It's pretty...
Yeah, and that's so true, because also we're having babies later. So having a 5-year gap between the two is quite impossible for a lot of women. I had my first child at 36. There's no way I could have waited 5 years for the next one. I didn't feel I could in terms of my fertility sort of being available, in that sort of crude phrase. But I think that the sort of response I saw when I wrote the piece was very much like, I had NHS doctors saying I'm only working 4 days, not 5. A lot of people not taking pay rises, deliberately trying to manage how much they earn in proportion to how much their partner earns to ensure that they get the certain tax breaks and benefits, particularly in respect to childcare. It's like trying to navigate your earning power and, frankly, your productivity in around a tax system that is so punitive to high earners.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to me to be a recipe for growth.
No, and people choosing
the very opposite.
Exactly, and people choosing the 4 days a week, or even 3, and then not thinking about the impact that might have for your career, like longer term.
Yeah.
And it's because also then if you're suddenly kind of up on a 150, 160, which clearly is a very good salary, there's also a real kind of anger that not getting this funding, because you think, I'm paying so much in tax at this level that the take-home pay per month between someone on like 150 and 99, once you've factored in childcare, but there's hardly any difference.
Well, yeah, I think that's the statistic, isn't it? That if you that you need to earn £149,000 before you make up for the losses that you have in terms of childcare.
Yeah.
So it's a fair system as well. Sorry, Eliza, because you could have 2 earners both on 60, and you would still get the entitlement. But the minute one of you goes £1 over 100k, you lose it all.
And that's what's interesting. Is normally these tax or childcare conversations are just impacting the woman. But the response I got from my article was very much from husbands going, oh no, I'm being very careful about how much I earn, to make sure that we don't go over that. I don't go over that threshold and impact the childcare as a household. Yeah. Exactly.
And I don't think we talk about the sort of, I've got people who are sort of lying awake at night because they are anxious, especially from their job like tech sales, where you get, really big commission. And 1 month might be, is that a very lumpy income, and sort of not quite knowing how to plan for it. I think on top of the funded childcare hours have been rolled out to now from the age of 9 months, which is amazing. I think that's a great, that's welcome, because people have always said waiting until your child's 3 to get any benefits is quite hard. But I think that in response to that, the nurseries had then upped their kind of daily fee because the government subsidy isn't enough.
Yeah.
So I'm hopefully not blaming the nurseries at all. My nursery for my youngest said that the funding didn't even cover the rent of their building. So it's sort of,
wow.
You understand, we don't want these places shutting.
Well, hundreds and thousands of nurseries are shutting because they just can't make it work financially, and that has all sorts of terrible knock-on problems for productivity for women's ability to work and so on. But it's not just about childcare. I mean, you modelled an example of a Henry who was a childless, but who was still really struggling because of the cost of living, which has gone up hugely. And he's a fiscal drag, which has dragged many more people into paying much more tax. And housing is a huge part of this as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and when we modelled it, we deliberately decided that Henry, and let's remember that's an acronym for high earners not rich yet, if you don't know what that means. Henry, we wanted him to be child-free and not have the burden of childcare to really illustrate how 100k isn't really even covering the basics for those that think it should. And this is the important thing, is we're not saying that 100k is a bad salary and that you're on the breadline and that you can't afford to exist. It's more that it's a case of like mixed expectations. So we modelled Henry, who was on 50k a year in 2019, and by 2025 had increased his salary up to 100k. And yet, in terms of disposable income, once you took out housing costs, once you took out the rising food costs, once you took out sort of all those essentials, it only resulted in a 6k salary increase of disposable income.
A year,
not a month. And go to the article, see how we broke it down. But it is quite striking, as you say. Henry is someone who cannot afford to get on the housing ladder in London, unless he has the bank of mum and dad, which we know, which is over 50% of Londoners who are able to become first-time buyers, have that bank of mum and dad support system to get on the housing ladder. And so I think this is why we wrote the piece, because it's actually about those that on paper seem to be doing well. 100k feels, psychologically like a real milestone in your professional career, at least it should. And yet there's no feeling of reward in terms of big ticket items in life, and critically reward in disposable income and just, let's say shopping at a certain supermarket over another supermarket, or eating out in certain restaurants, and I do think that certainly those that earn 100k outside of London perhaps have less issues on the housing front. There is a regional dimension to this. I think those that earn 100k as freelancers, going back to your point, it's harder to calculate how you manage those sums and play the system, as it were. There's all sorts of variables. It's harder for those with kids, of course. But the fundamental thing is that 100k doesn't get you perhaps what you think it should.
Let's talk about why this matters, why people watching this who may not be earning 100k should care about this. And we've touched on some of the things, which is, of course, that these people pay large amounts of taxes, which pays for public services that we all depend on. We've talked about the impacts on growth. But the point is, some of these people will leave. And I think there's a deeper question here about what kind of country do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a country where middle class aspiration, the kind of ordinary things that people might want, like shopping and going on holidays, owning a house, are so out of reach?
I mean, I think there's a really important conversation to be had around the sort of downward social mobility we have seen in this country amongst those under the age of 45. I wrote a whole book about it, essentially, and those that have managed to millennials and Gen Z that have managed to secure some level of financial stability and aspiration have often done it with the help of mum and dad, plus a professional career. You frankly need both. And I think, therefore, there needs to be a conversation around opportunity, economic growth, tax. The economic problems we have in this country can't just focus on the pockets of serious poverty we have in this country, the lack of investment, of course, working poverty, huge problem, but also, like you say, the decline of middle class aspiration and mobility and security, because you need to look at both. And there needs to be, frankly, a solidarity between the working class and the middle class. Karl Marx wrote about this in the 18th Brumaire. Like, you need the petty bourgeoisie to buy into the sort of the revolution that needs to happen, because we do need a reckoning of what it's doing to middle class aspiration. And emigration is talked about a lot, and I know you're seeing that in your clients. That's just one aspect of the sort of lack of hope and powerlessness that is evident in the working class and the middle class in this country. And that is dangerous, I would argue. Politically dangerous, socially and economically dangerous.
I think you see this in your clients, don't
Yeah,
you?
that's sort of like, what's the point? Which is awful. It's really depressing. It is really depressing. I've seen a few people kind of move in recent months, choosing, Portugal, Dubai, further east, and just where, lower taxes. And I mean, in Portugal, it's not even that much lower, but just if you can get a similar salary, better standard of living, maybe not work quite so many hours, and people particularly with young children, it's sort of immediate to see the benefits, and that's such a shame when we don't want these people leaving our country when they are helping grow the economy, or paying tax and being high earners.
I think you also talked about some of the differing attitudes to wealth between people who may be born with it. So some of the people you're talking about who had help from their parents, and people who are kind of the first generation in their family to do well.
Absolutely, and I help a lot of people where they didn't have anyone at home talking about these things growing up. So even just really sort of simple terms of looking at where your money is in the bank, using an ISA, knowing that's something you can put into every year, that a cash ISA kind of will keep as cash and probably not keep up with inflation, whereas you kind of can invest it in a stocks and shares ISA and that will grow. So just sort of kind of things that you might have heard if you had grown up with family with money, although not always the case. Friends of mine who kind of knew what to do often had parents who were accountants, and that's like pretty much the only people who knew what to do with money. So it's but I'm seeing and particularly if you're the first person to be kind of high earning, there's an awful pressure sometimes they can put on themselves. How much do I need to support parents, siblings, community, a big one as well, and some of that is from pressure from that side, saying we expect it. They think they're on this really high salary, 100,000, 6 figures, but like that sort of that those expectations versus what's reality, and then actually really being stretched because they feel that's an obligation, or sometimes it's self-imposed, and actually they think, I'm earning this really high salary, I should be sharing it. It's not necessarily true, but it's that feeling, and because as a society we don't talk about money, it becomes an issue.
I think you're absolutely right, and there is a massive difference between sort of first generation wealth and second generation wealth, and if that first generation wealth is reaching a certain level but is not providing a level of security that you think it should, there's a paranoia and a fear around that is really hard to address and rectify. But I think, just getting back to the politics of this for a second, when I wrote the article, I knew it would stir some frankly rightful hate, right? Because
people read it here.
Yeah, well, and it's fair, because there's a lot of people struggling. There is a lot of people who don't have 1 or 2 months savings in the bank just in case money. There's a lot of people who are dependent on obviously welfare payments. There's a lot of people there who are not getting paid enough. However, I think there's a really important kind of political edge to this, is that I think for a long time the Treasury, both Tory and Labour, have relied on Henrys to kind of stump up more and more. And I think there is becoming a tipping point, a dangerous tipping point, where people are leaving, or people are thinking, what's the point, or people are working less, and actually the politics of that needs adjusting. And I think there's also, with reform, a politics of division that is very prevalent, I think, in this country right now, which is either people that pay a lot of tax going, where's that money going? It's being squandered. It's not being used properly. There's people not working and claiming benefits. So that division from higher earners to lower earners, and then lower earners going, you're earning all that money. You have a lovely lifestyle. You're not suffering in the way that I am. And actually, there's so many commonalities between those two groups, and there's so few politicians talking about it. And actually, I think there is a really serious, as I said, reckoning economically that Stuart Rose talked about, is that there's and Britain felt it in the 70s as well. this sort of wake-up call, whether it's going to be a call to the IMF or whether it's going to be a political wake-up call domestically. I feel like we're edging towards that. And this is part of that conversation, a really important part of that conversation. It's not the only conversation, though.
But I don't think it will be picked up by this government because, you know, you don't want to change a tax rate. That looks bad. You know, you don't want to be seen to be doing anything that benefits someone earning over 100,000. You know, it looks terrible, like politically. But at the same time, it's driving all these behaviours we're seeing.
But the politics of this is that, you know, the private school VAT increase was obviously, you know, optically, you know, great for Labour Party solidarity. But how many people really know about the fiscal drag? If a politician made some statement on that, you know, very few people would understand it, and it wouldn't have the same sort of cachet as the private school fees VAT. And there is, I think, things that the Treasury can be doing and thinking about, and politicians articulating that mean that these problems are addressed. This is impacting growth. This is impacting critically optimism. That, I think, is most of the conversations I have within my peer group, you know, across all quite various different professions, groups, socioeconomic divides, there's no hope in this country for young people.
There's no hope of a better life.
Specifically for young people. And what's interesting is our parents are starting to have that conversation as well.
I also think that this has direct implications for demands on the public purse. I mean, I literally heard the head of the RMT on the radio this morning. You know, they're on strike at the moment. They already earn a pretty decent wage, well above average. But this trade union said, well, 100K doesn't buy your house in London. So that's why we're on strike. I mean, so that has direct consequences for this Labour government on how much it's going to have to spend. And yeah, as you say, I think the political ramifications of living in a country where it seems impossible that young people can have a better life than their parents are devastating. Absolutely. But let's try and talk about some solutions. Philly, if you are a Henry and you are in this position, what can you do to improve your finances?
So whenever I work with someone, I start off with, well, first of all, what's your money story? What are the narratives you're telling yourself around money? What did you hear growing up around money? Is it true? You know, questioning that, because sometimes our behaviours around money really will kind of stem from that. And, you know, that can be quite a light bulb moment straight away. But then getting really clear on what you want, what matters to you, like what are your values? These are things we do not often stop to think about. You know, what matters to you, and then how can you then be intentional with spending, saving, and then ultimately investing. And it can make choosing to spend on something, and then, again, it makes it easier to choose what you're spending on, and also choose not to spend on something if you say, that is not getting me close to my goal. That does not make me live kind of in alignment with my values. And this might sound flowery. It's really not. It actually is life-changing. And I know it works because, you know, it works for my clients, essentially. So getting really clear on what matters. It's worth spending the time thinking about, what do you care about? So like for me, one of my top values is connection. So in my diary each week, I've got time with my husband, time with my children, because, you know, if you'd have asked me probably 5 years ago, I'd have said, family is like a real connection. Well, you know, wrangling 2 children into a double buggy is family time, but it's not particularly enjoyable time. So actually for me, I've had to get into like, what actually is it? And it's like the bit where you're like making them laugh before bed or something, and that's real connection. So if you can then purposely put connection time, and that's, you know, my book group each month with my friends, and it's so kind of, it's not just money, it's your time and your energy. So kind of getting really clear on that. And this can then stem through into then how you spend your money. So those are sort of more, I guess, philosophical than actual practical. But then, you know, the things like, what interest rates your cash getting in the bank? Is it getting enough? Can you put aside money for longer term that you could invest? You know, think about that growth. And just, you know, are you putting money into your pension? Do you know what you put into your pension? But because you get tax relief on pension contributions, that is something that it is for future you. So you get a bit less in your payslip, but actually then that can start compounding and growing over time.
You're absolutely right on the kind of financial education thing. One of the things that I've seen really surprisingly is the amount that Gen Z are investing.
Yeah.
There's massive rise, and just under 50% of Gen Z in this country invest beyond their pension. Right now, it may be short term, it may be small amounts, but the level of financial education that Gen Z are doing, either on TikTok or on YouTube or various other platforms, can only be welcomed, I think. And that speaks to a generation that know that they cannot live by one salary alone.
Yeah.
And they need multiple streams of revenue, frankly. And I think that there is a level of financial savviness and, frankly, sexiness amongst Gen Z. I think I'm really worried about this rump.
Risk.
Of course.
Because a lot of them
Yeah.
invest in crypto.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with having crypto as part of the portfolio, but when it's not understanding yours, and I get a lot of comments and questions around, huge percentages of the portfolio being in crypto and not understanding the volatility of it and not actually understanding it, and thinking about being diversified and across a sort of number of asset classes, just and countries and companies, and that's something that's missing. So although it is great to support
100%
investing,
100%, I think there's a sort of level of sort of Wild West nature of financial advice out there, which is why sort of regulated financial advice is so important. But I think the bit I'm worried about is the bit in the middle, those that didn't get, and let's remember Gen Z are the beneficiaries of auto-enrollment as well. It's that rump in the middle of millennials and Gen Xers, number of whom are self-employed and have had sort of slightly sort of all over the place careers and have multiple little bit of pension pots and haven't consolidated them, or have years of being freelance and not saved and all that kind of stuff. If you have children, obviously that massively impacts your pension. And now just thinking about what does retirement look like in an age where I'm probably going to have to work longer. Probably, who knows? Very few millennials believe the state pension will be around when they retire. And just thinking very differently about that sort of retirement model that perhaps our parents were able to enjoy. Inheritance obviously comes into this. I know loads of people are not paying into their pension, but are expecting an inheritance to collide with their retirement.
But that's risky as well, because
Hugely.
you decide to tax that.
Hugely.
Take it away.
Hugely. And I know,
spend it on care costs.
I know exactly. I know someone who said to me, I'm not paying into my pension. She's a lawyer. I'm not paying into my pension. My cost of living's too high, school fees, etc., etc. But my father-in-law, I suspect, will kick bucket when I'm about to retire. So therefore it does all sort of happen wonderfully synergized at the same time. I said, that's a great belief and faith you have in your marriage, number one. And secondly, his life trajectory. But I think it's really sort of that bit in the middle that are at the point of pressure where cost of living, expenses, the sort of need to save is there, but the desire and aptitude for saving isn't quite there potentially, but also maybe haven't thought about investments and savings in the same way that even Gen Z are, however risky.
I think that's a reasonably positive note to end on.
Is it? I don't think it is.
I think Gen Z, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, here at City M, we have a lot of young colleagues, and maybe partly because they work at a financial newspaper, but as you say, they're all investing, they're taking more risks, and I suppose maybe the future's better for them. Especially if they keep reading City AM.
Well, I think it's also a sort of like, we are seeing the slow death of the property owning democracy dream. And I think that the sort of vision of housing as an investment rather than housing as a home was there for our parents, who underwent a sort of Thatcherite revolution and saw massive gains in the value of their homes with very little being put into it. Is that earned income? Who knows? But if you're under 30, that dream seems so distant.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, sort of slightly illogical. If you're slightly more nomadic and slightly freer with your career, there's not that same romantic vision of home ownership than there was. And for baby boomers, Gen X, and even millennials, I think, still hanker after that sort of...
I think everybody does. The sense of owning something, of having a roof over your head, and some of it's yours.
Of course, no, but I think that idea of home is my pension, home is their investment. That's how my parents certainly saw home ownership. And they were right to, because it will and has for my mum. But I think just the younger generations are seeing opportunities elsewhere. And I think it's not just investment. I think that multiple streams of revenue is, I'm not going to just focus on one salary. Yeah. I'm going to actually be savvy and make money in multiple directions, be it on Vinted, YouTube, and my standard salary.
Any words of advice for someone who wants to, a Gen Z who hopes to one day earn 100K?
I'd get clear on what you want, I think. Get clear on what you want, and then it'll make it easier to sort of actually put aside for it. I think getting clear on what you want, it makes purposeful action.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. It's been a really interesting talk. Thanks for getting here as well.